Great, thank you very much. I think I'll stand, actually. Just to wave my arms a little bit. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Anne, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to an audience like you. So, as was already said, my name is Mazalek. I'm a human-computer interaction and digital media researcher, so this talk may be a little bit unlike what you typically see in this seminar series, and you may be wondering what I'm doing here, and hopefully this is apparent from the title, Grasping the Numerical World, Bringing Bioinformatics Out of the Box. So I want to start by saying that, as you've hopefully gleaned from Bruce's presentation, I mean the word grasping literally, because the area of human-computer interaction that I focus on is called tangible and embodied interaction. And I'll explain more in detail what this means soon, but first I wanted to start with a little bit of an introduction to set the stage. Hopefully these little clips will play. So my particular interest in talking to an audience like you stems from the fact that a number of years my work in building new kinds of digital tools and interfaces has increasingly shifted into looking at how these tools and interfaces can support discovery and learning in the sciences. So my own background is actually very interdisciplinary. I began in math and computer science, but always had an interest in media and design, and especially in new forms of representation that can help us in thinking about and engaging with complex ideas. So sometimes these complex ideas have been multi-threaded narratives, like in the little video playing on the left. Other times they're computational games, like the spatial cognition game that you see in the middle, and at other times they deal with scientific problems. Especially ones that are either very data intense or where they're or very complex, and where new approaches and perspectives can help in creating insights. And this is really what I want to talk about today. Basically, how emerging digital and tangible media technologies can be used to support and enhance scientific practice. So as a very quick outline, this is essentially what I'm going to talk about today. I'll start with some background and explain my approach, and then I'll talk about some research projects in my lab, and then I'll wrap up with a few takeaways. So my approach is informed by the increasing evidence and understanding that we have from the cognitive sciences of the role that the perceptual and motor systems play in the cognitive system. So the term that's most used to kind of encompass this set of ideas is embodied cognition. Illustrated a little bit on this diagram here. One particular theory that illustrates this is known as common coding theory. Common coding theory was first formulated by Wolfgang Prinz and his colleagues from the Max Planck Institute. And basically, it argues for a shared representation in the brain that connects an organism's movements, its actual movements through its motor system, its observation of movements, and its imagination of movements. And the sort of central insight from this theory is a kind of body-based resonance. Basically, the body acts like a giant tuning fork, replicating all movements it detects, but the replicated movements are not overtly executed. So there's a whole lot of empirical evidence behind this theory, and I don't really have time to go into that today, but I'd like to explain briefly how this connects to scientific practice and discovery. So my collaborators, two cognitive scientists, Sanjay Chandrasekharan and Nancy Nersessian, have used theories of embodied cognition, especially like common coding, as the basis for explaining how building models, particularly models with dynamic visualizations, can lead to new discoveries and insights. The central idea behind their explanation is a coupling between the modeler's imagination, the external dynamic visualization, and then the external manipulation of the model, which enables the modeler to basically, over time, gain a kind of intuitive sense of the mechanism that they're trying to model. So in other words, the model building process creates these kind of abstractive capabilities and a sort of intuition about the system's dynamic. So basically it lets the researchers get a feel for the model by literally building and manipulating it. And this feel for the model is even stronger when the motor system is deeply engaged in the process along with the perceptual and cognitive systems. So how many of you are familiar with a game called Foldit? Yeah, wonderful. So usually when I talk to HCI audiences, no one's heard of this game. Here it's the other way around. So Foldit is essentially a video game that's built on top of a computational model that allows novel protein folds to be designed by everyday game players. And the work was initially started with researchers who were trying to harness the power of many processors to solve protein folding problems. But their algorithms were failing. So they partnered with computer graphics researchers, and then what they created was basically a graphical representation that would let them see in real time what the algorithms were doing. And now what's interesting is that this yielded a kind of insight. Basically, they found that the algorithms were failing on the exact parts of the problem that humans are really good at, namely the parts of the problem that require spatial thinking. So this kind of gave them an idea. They said, well, why don't we changed this graphical representation into an interactive graphical representation. In other words, a video game. So instead of harnessing the power of many processors, what they could do now is harness the power of many game players. And what's most interesting is many people who are actually not trained in biochemistry. So suddenly you could have a 13-year-old game player solve protein folds that top biochemists in the world have not been able to solve for 15 years. So this kind of crowdsourcing of solutions to scientific problems is really interesting and new. It's kind of like citizen science, I think is the term that's used to encompass this. But I argue that what's really new here is not just the crowdsourcing aspect, but the fact that they actually provided a new representation of the problem. A representation that allowed even novices to basically directly manipulate the model. Players could basically get a sense of how proteins could be folded by twisting, pulling, jiggling, and coming up with an intuitive sense of how they could fold the proteins. And so in doing this, they were essentially coupling the external representation of the problem with the computational model of the protein structure and their internal mental model of the problem through their perceptual and motor systems. In other words, they were doing kind of what common coding theory argues for. So I'll get back to this idea in a moment, but first I'd like to give another quick example, one that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But the fact is that building and manipulating models is actually not new. It's been essential to scientific problem solving and discovery throughout history. And this is naturally one of the most, if not the most, famous examples. Watson and Crick gained an understanding of the structure of DNA by manipulating balls and sticks. And basically, in doing this, they externalized their ideas about the structure, and it gave their motor and perceptual systems something to play with that in turn fed their imagination. But nowadays, like in the case of Foldit, we have different kinds of models. Computational models that harness the power of high-performance computing and large data sets, and visualization techniques that can make the data and models accessible to the visual senses. But for the most part, the physical models, like the one built by Watson and Crick, and the computational ones remain separate things that don't interact with one another. So then we might ask, what's the difference between the physical models and the newer computational ones? Well, for one thing, the old physical models aren't linked to computational ones, which limits their complexity, and it also makes it harder to construct models for very large data sets, or ones that are dynamic or lack an inherent spatial structure. Advanced numerical methods and computational techniques have vastly extended the types of problems that we're able to tackle in scientific research, which is a great power of computation. But on the downside, the computational processes are like these little black boxes that don't let the researchers get inside and to get an understanding of how the solution is being reached. So like in the case of Foldit, the algorithms were failing, and the researchers didn't really understand why until there was a real-time representation of what the algorithms were doing. Moreover, the visuals associated with the computational models are typically after-the-fact visual outputs of the simulation, like graphs, and recently also interactive graphics that can be filtered and viewed in different ways. But few of these visualizations link interactivity to the underlying model in a dynamic and game-like way. So even fewer of them, I'd say, connect the visual representation to a physical one, like the one that was built by Watson and Crick. So I believe this is where new technologies, emerging technologies, really have power, because they can enable us to create new kinds of interfaces for building and manipulating computational models and data sets that will leverage the best of both worlds, basically, leading hopefully to new and improved ways of forming insights. So in human-computer interaction, we call these new kinds of interfaces tangible and embodied interfaces, or TEIs. And a predominant idea in TEI is that the physical objects, surfaces, and spaces of our world can serve as both controls and representations for digital information. And this not only serves to more seamlessly bridge the physical and the digital worlds, but also allows people to use their hands and bodies in a much more natural way when they manipulate digital information. So you don't really need to worry too much about the details of the TEI conceptual model that's shown here, but two important properties of tangible embodied interfaces that I'd like to highlight are: first, they engage the motor system along with the perceptual system, and then second, they allow multiple people to work together on specific problems. So you might think of these interfaces a little bit like something like the interfaces in the film Minority Report, which indeed, interestingly enough, drew many of its interface ideas from the lab where I did my graduate studies at MIT. But at the time, most of these interfaces existed only in conceptual and sometimes prototype form, but a lot has changed in the years since then. And in recent years, advances in both sensing and display technologies have enabled TEI researchers to build and experiment with new kinds of interfaces, ranging from things like multi-touch tabletops that can track and sense the position and orientation of physical objects, to gestures, and full body interaction system. The applications explored have been really broad, and they include things like the urban planning and simulation system, shown on the top left, which is kind of an early example, as well as the advanced tabletop musical synthesizer-like instrument, which is shown on the top right, and is actually now commercially available, and it does have an iPad version too, as well as the tabletop. Although I guess arguably the most success in the commercial realm has been in gaming, with platforms like the Kinect, and then the various interfaces that you can use with the Wii console, from the Wiimote to the balance boards and other things. So my focus is a little bit different from most of the other applications I've explored, in that I want to look at how these technologies can be used and built to support scientific discovery and learning. So with that, I'd like to now switch gears and show a few ongoing research projects that use tangible and embodied interaction as an approach for tackling problems in computational biology and clinical research. The fourth project on the list was already presented by Ruspe, so I'll focus on the first three. So the first project I'd like to talk about today is called Pathways, and Pathways builds on a long-standing collaboration with systems biologists as well as cognitive scientists at Georgia Tech. And at Georgia Tech, in these labs, they've been using computational models to model biochemical reaction networks in various organisms. And for the most part, they're using mathematical models like ordinary differential equations to represent the dynamic systems they're modeling, and then they write optimization algorithms to test out different parameters to see if they can get their model to fit a set of experimental data. And they might be drawing this experimental data either from collaborators from the wet lab or also from literature. So they use a variety of mostly static representations throughout this process, and these might be equations, they might be diagrams that they've sketched on paper, and it might also be graphs that are plotted as outputs of their simulations. So in contrast, our approach, which is shown on the right here, uses tangible and embodied interaction approaches to build and test these models against an experimental data set. So we're essentially taking the very scattered process and then bringing it all into one. Basically, our system opens up the algorithmic black boxes and gives the modelers embodied controls for manipulating different visual representations of the model and comparing it to experimental results in order to get an intuitive and embodied understanding of the system. So we've gone through two major iterations of this system. The first version, called Kinesthetic Pathways, focused on fitting preloaded models to experimental data. And then the second version, Active Pathways, extended this to provide new interaction techniques to support model construction. So I'd like to show a couple of videos of the two now. So the first version, like I said, supported fitting of models to experimental data, basically by letting users adjust parameters like concentrations in molecules and reaction speeds using a physical dial that could be attached to the graphical representation of the molecules and reactions in the network. I'll just start playing the video and, for the sake of time, talk over it. I don't think the audio is on board. So the results of these changes can then be visualized across the network and also in traditional graphs. So you'll see that here. So you can see my PhD student in the middle there is manipulating concentration value of the dial, and all of the changes in real time are reflected both into the network shown on the table as well as into graphs. We also provided a new visualization, which is the radar chart. You can kind of see it up there on the top right, that visualized the RMS error and provided kind of a way for users to see the overall fit across the network. One of the things that was interesting is that the researchers that we worked with commented that they were really surprised and they really liked the RMS error visualization, And they commented that they wouldn't have expected that showing the RMS error visually in real time as they worked would be so helpful in understanding kind of the overall relationship between parameters and changes in fit. The other thing I should mention briefly about this process, this project, is that like the tangible biological networks work, it's done through a participatory design process where we work closely with the systems biologists in their labs, and it also builds on 2 years of ethnographic research that my cognitive sciences collaborators conducted in the lab to understand their existing processes. So when we started to design new interaction techniques, we were informed by what they were currently doing, but then we're also working with them to transform that and try to get a sense and design new things that might change their way of thinking about their problem. So the second version that I'd like to show, like I mentioned, addresses the idea that the modelers also need an approach to construct the model and input the equations into the system. So instead of just providing tangible controls like a dial and objects to show or hide charts, the new system also allows binding of physical objects, little cubes like the one shown here, called Siftio cubes with displays on them, to components of the system that are being modeled, like molecules or reactions. So constructing the network becomes as easy as assembling the structure of a molecule out of balls and sticks, like Watson and Crick did. So except in this case, it's a dynamic system. So basically, the users can take a molecule cube in one hand and a second molecule cube in another hand, touch the two together, and then create a reaction between them. And then the molecules, of course, can be placed on the table to visualize the dynamic nature of the model and do things like adjust parameters and fit the model to the data set similar to the previous system. So I'll show a quick video of this one too. Set the direction of the reaction of both the cubes together. Switch gears to the next project now, and this one is called Tangible Mitochondrial DNA, or MtDNA, and it was motivated by the fact that a large portion of genomic data that's used in human cancer research is genomic mutation data. So in this case, we started working with researchers from the Ontario Institutes for Cancer Research, where they've sequenced the mtDNA of a large number of cancer patients and also collected clinicopathological data, for example, age, hemoglobin levels, and other things like that. So ultimately, in this case, the researchers hope to find patterns in the data that might give them insight into the relationships between the clinical features and the mutations, which could then in turn help them in making predictions or in determining possible treatment plans for the patients. But given that such a large amount of data, what was interesting for us is that they often don't know what they're looking for, or even what questions to ask about their data. So as a result, we kind of began building the tangible mtDNA system, again in a participatory design process, and it's designed to help the researchers in finding patterns in the data by interacting with our custom-built interactive objects called actables on an interactive display. So I have a short video again here. So And I'll just say, so in our current prototypes, we've worked with prostate cancer and breast cancer data sets, and again, just the mitochondrial DNA portion of the genome, but we're actually looking to extend this project to the full genome and 70 different cancers, which will pose poses a lot of new challenges from both the computation and the interaction perspectives. But this is kind of the first prototype. See where all the mutation locations are. Like in pathways where you can bind different molecules to different interactive objects, here you can use different interactive objects to search the data set along different parameters, according to different parameters, or gene segments. So stacking lets you compare across two different views on the data. Clustering. So the interesting thing with the clustering is if you imagine that you have you've clustered according to patients, and you see that the patients are grouped according to their mutation patterns, then you get a new patient, let's say, and so you add that patient to the set. The patient falls in a specific cluster, and now as a doctor you may know that you've already applied a given treatment plan to the set of patients in that cluster and that it's worked or not worked. So immediately you have a starting point. You can say, okay, this might be a good way that I could start treatment for this new patient, or this might not be a good way because nothing that I tried on these other patients has worked yet, so I need to try something new. So those are some of the ways that we would envision a system like that being used. Yes, I'll switch to the third project now. So this was actually a project that was initiated by RISBE in response to the Prostate Cancer Dream Challenge in, I think it was 2015. And the challenge in this case was to develop models for predicting patient outcomes in metastatic castrate-resistant prostate cancer using a database of patients and clinical covariates like demographics, lesion measures, and so forth. So the dependent variables in this case included survival outcome, the last known day that the patient was alive, the discontinuation of the treatment due to an adverse event, for example, and so forth. And in this case, again, the typical approach that's used here is to use this data to develop a model that can algorithmically provide predicted outputs based on a doctor's input for a current patient. And this type of model can be extremely valuable, but at the same time it's problematic because it doesn't really support doctors in gaining an understanding from the existing data set in order for them to be able to make their own judgments and predictions about a current patient's situation. So we decided to take a rather different approach to tackling the problem and provide a tangible tabletop tool that would instead allow doctors to navigate the data set on their own and draw comparisons between different features across patients and start to get an intuitive understanding of the relationships. And then this kind of tool would eventually allow those, not in the first version, but would eventually allow them to build their own model for predicting patient outcomes and then test it against predictions that are provided by existing models in the system. So in our first prototype, doctors can use their smartphones to browse and select the outputs that they're interested in predicting, and then select features of interest from the zoomable interface, which you can see on the bottom left there. The results are then visualized on a tabletop display, the one on the bottom right here, where different interactions can be performed, like selecting useful combinations from a scatter plot in order to visualize a feature interaction network. So this work is still in the early stages and lots remains to be done. For example, to design interaction approaches that will allow doctors to build their own models and then test them against predictions that are provided by the existing models in the system. So I have a short clip of our first prototype here. So you can see as the feature as a feature is selected, a scatter plot you'll see in a moment is generated on the tabletop in the background. And then when the phone's placed on the table, it's associated with the corresponding scatter plot. And this basically allows multiple phones to display different scatter plots and feature interaction networks and make comparisons between them at the same time. Great. So again, the next step would be to allow doctors to test their obtained feature network against other existing networks that might have been saved by other doctors on the server for comparison. So doctors could basically then improve their suggested treatment by adding more useful and more accurate covariates to their diagnoses. So the fourth project that I had on my list is tangible biological networks. And it actually uses, as you've seen, many similar approaches to the projects that I've shown so far, but extends these interactions beyond the tabletop and mobile devices alone to this large interactive wall display. And since Rizbe already talked about the details of the project earlier, I'm not going to go over it again in detail, but I did want to mention, again briefly, just to note that the kind of often web-based interfaces have a lot of limitations with working with large data sets. For example, they're designed for single users. Navigating and searching the data can be an arduous task with lots of menus and search boxes. Making comparisons across data sets and searches and managing multiple views can be very difficult. And then the visualizations are static, or at best, kind of an interactive output rather than a real-time manipulable model that could be coupled to the data. So our hope is that new kinds of interfaces can help to overcome these limitations and to help re-envision how we work with large data sets. So intangible biological networks, and this perhaps addresses Michelle's question a little bit, intangible biological networks were essentially scaffolding the design and development of what we hope will become a kind of toolkit of interaction approaches for interacting with various kinds of data sets using different platforms and devices, like interactive tabletops, mobile devices, custom-built tangibles, large wall displays, as well as regular desktop computers. But the ultimate vision is that if you can create this kind of a toolkit of interaction approaches that work across many different kinds of devices and platforms, then as a lab, whatever devices and platforms you have available for accessing and manipulating the data might be able to use to tackle or work on a given problem at a given time. So for example, if you have the fancy eyewall and the interactive table and the custom tangibles, you can work with those. Arguably, it may give you a better and more tangible experience. But on the other hand, if your lab just has desktop computers plugged into a projector, some iPads, some laptops, the mobile phones you've got in your pockets, you could use those as well. Maybe ultimately you could also do things like assemble ad hoc a larger table by putting iPads together on a table to create a larger tabletop display. So there's a variety of flexibility, but it comes from this idea of being able to create interaction approaches that cross separate devices and platforms. And this is kind of a new area within human-computer interaction, this area of cross-device interaction that has gained interest in the last few years because we have so many more devices than just our computers. We carry usually at least 3 or 4 of them around with us on a daily basis. And how can we start to leverage all of these devices so that we have interactions with them together, and interactions that we can actually use to do more than just check our email and schedules and figure out where we're going and Google something, but also in a way that we can actually use them productively in our work practices. Oops. Slide. So I covered quite a lot in this talk, probably very quickly because I was worried I was going to run out of time. So I'd like to take a minute to highlight the main takeaways. So first of all, I'd say computation has dramatically changed the way that science is practiced. And this has tremendous benefits, yet at the same time it's created a lot of black boxes of things that are currently addressed algorithmically, but that our cognitive capabilities don't fully engage with or understand. Second, evidence from the cognitive sciences, namely embodied cognition, which I talked about earlier, tells us that building models, both physical and computational ones, is important. And given the increasing understanding of the role that our motor and perceptual systems play in thinking and learning, there are potential benefits from merging the two, the physical models with the digital models and computational models. Third, human-computer interaction research provides new approaches for interacting with computational media that are more tangible and embodied. And these can in turn change the way that we interact with large and complex data sets and models. and ultimately make an impact on the practice of computational science. So Foldit provides kind of an inspiration in this context, but there are many problems that are much less spatial and far more abstract than the protein folding problem that Foldit tackles, and hence even more challenging to design for. So this is the challenge that my lab is taking on. And I want to say, just kind of on that note, in my lab we design and develop these new tangible tools to interactively navigate and visualize large amounts of data in order to improve understanding and provide insights. And in doing this, we're particularly excited to extend our existing collaborations to work with more researchers in biology and bioinformatics and related areas in order to investigate how our approaches can apply to diverse problems in these areas and support problem solving and discovery. And I really think that that's an important aspect, because we're not going to be able to design these kinds of tools unless we sort of scaffold them from ground up, tackling one individual problem at a time and gradually building up a set of many interaction approaches. Because once you build many individual things, you can start to see general patterns and trends that emerge in the interaction that you can apply to many different categories of problems. So already you probably saw some common threads between the projects in terms of the types of interactions. So things like stacking or bumping things together came up, moving stuff around on interactive displays, moving information between different surfaces, walls, tables, tablet computers. And so trying to kind of scaffold these interaction approaches and then find what works best for different types of problems is what we have to do. So ultimately, I guess we have two more goals in this context, and they kind of tackle this challenge from two sides. So from an HCI perspective, my hope is that we can aim to create a kind of tangible computational biology toolkit, a TCBTK, if you will, that will allow for us to extend our interaction techniques to different data sets and problems. And then from a science perspective, we hope that through collaboration and design processes like the participatory design that both Ruzbe and I have talked about, that bridge HCI with biology, we can increasingly put our tools in the hands of biology and medical researchers and help them informing insights, and also have them help us in furthering the design of the tools that we're building. So I think I've left plenty of time for questions, hopefully. So with that, I want to say thank you. Of course, I should note that none of this would have been done, has been done by me alone. So I'd like to express immense gratitude, first and foremost, to my fabulous postdocs and students. The ones who were involved in the projects shown on the slides today are all listed up here, as well as to my research collaborators on these projects, and of course all the other students and postdocs who've worked in my lab. And then last but not least, I'd like to thank the funding agencies that have generally supported my lab's work and that keep my students fed. They're all up at the top, and that's my lab's logo, the Synesthetic Media Lab at the bottom. So with that said, I'd be happy to take questions.
So you talked a bit about how people can better understand by interacting with physical models. So does that type of benefit to transfer over towards, say, AR or VR?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
And interestingly, this is something that we're experiencing. So VR's got a variety of issues to overcome still, right? So one of the things is that everything's virtual and you can't grab hold of anything. So that does bizarre things to our motor and perceptual systems, especially to our perceptual systems. There's all sorts of mismatches between the virtual world and then what our bodies are physically experiencing, especially with navigation and simulator sickness. So there's a lot of design problems to overcome in VR, but with that said, in kind of another area of research that my lab is looking at, we're actually using virtual reality and coupling it with tangible interaction. So trying to get some of the motor system engaged within the virtual reality environment in order to support spatial cognition. I would call that more the sort of fundamental cog-sci research that my lab does, like building tools and then looking at how it enhances cognition. But I think many of those approaches, once we've refined the interaction techniques enough, could then be applied to the applied areas, like working with scientific data and scientific problems, for example. So yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so you've also mentioned AR. So I've had, it's virtual reality and augmented reality do two different things. They almost have opposite visions. Intangibles aligns more with VR. It's much more about integrating yourself into your real physical environment. Virtual reality separates you from your real physical environment. Each have different effects. I can't say that one's worse than the other. It's more that virtual reality is really good in cases where you want to be separate from the real world. Like in cases where you want to give the person, say, a new perspective that they couldn't have in the real world, so you need to kind of fully replace the real world with a virtual one to create some sort of illusion or something like that, or to travel into a space that they wouldn't be able to see, something too small or too large or too far away to explore, then that's where virtual reality comes in. Otherwise, I'd say that for the most part, being grounded and embedded in our physical world is important, and also facilitates things like collaboration and more kind of ad hoc interactions where you can employ, like when we think and brainstorm and design, we use arbitrarily things in our environment to stand in for other stuff, like, oh, well, let's just pretend that this cup is something, and then we illustrate a concept or an idea, and we're thinking through the process at the same time. And that's hard to do in a purely designed environment like virtual reality.
I have a question more about the one that you were using for modeling chemical networks. So do you see this more as a teaching tool or something that's actually going to be used in research?
Potentially both.
Okay.
And I think so. We started the project working with research labs as opposed to educational labs, and we had two sort of, I'd say, of the researchers that we were collaborating with. There were kind of two groups. The more senior researchers who were sort of very grounded in their approaches said, oh, well, we don't work this way. Like, that's really nice, great. It's a wonderful tool for illustration. But we tended to find that the sort of younger generation, the graduate students, even the undergraduate students, and to some extent the postdoctoral researchers who were relatively new in the practice, they were really excited about the tool, and they were the ones that we worked with most closely in designing it, because they thought, okay, so if it's built in the right way, I could see using this. So that's kind of on the research side, but there's a long way to go before you can actually get the tool to be usable by researchers. Yeah. On the education side, we definitely, like all of them said, this is something that I could use in my classroom. And so actually at this point, we now have a system set up at Georgia Tech. They've turned, Georgia Tech is a really interesting use case in the biomedical engineering department, because they basically, about 10 years ago, restructured their whole undergraduate curriculum to follow problem-based learning approaches. They actually brought in a bunch of learning scientists, restructured all their courses, and now the students read the lectures and stuff at home, and they work on the problems in class in groups. So it's actually the perfect environment to start to stick a tool like this in, so they can run experiments and sort of build ideas and build models in the classroom, but they're not ones that are completely open-ended necessarily. Sure. Yeah.
Folded deals with inherently 3D data, 3D protein structure data. Is there anyone in your group that has expertise or an interest in developing something with protein data or with drug design?
I don't know, it's a good question. Specifically at the moment, I would say I'm not aware of anyone. Rusbe, do you know if any of the folks on your teams have that specific interest right now, protein or drug?
Actually, I like to work on it.
Well, there you go. So there's one, at very least. But yeah, you're right, protein. But you're right. The folded works with these structural problems. So we've looked more at these more abstract data sets that don't have an inherent structural form. That's not to say that a lot of the techniques couldn't apply to the structural problems.
The only thing this reminds me of that comes to mind right now is a big room surrounded with TVs in Stony Brook. Long Island.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I wonder though if some companies in Switzerland or some companies in Boston or the Bay Area have something.
Yeah, it's quite possibly. I mean, I think it would be a really interesting direction. There are a couple of projects that I've seen sort of throughout the past, but they were really kind of early stage prototypes. There's one that I remember from Caltech many years ago that was kind of a DNA design thing that used. Not virtual, I think it was augmented reality. So you had a headset, but you were also using tangible tools to kind of build it up, but the thing that you were building was just virtual. But yeah, there's definitely potential down that path, I'd say. Question?
Yeah, so a lot of what you're dealing with is tangible things, so that, in my mind, that sort of confines you to a 3D space. So I'm wondering how you can sort of take the research that you're doing and apply it to a lot of our really like high-dimensional research that we're doing, like when the data is like 4-dimensional, really high dimensional, and you just can't necessarily hold it.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's a problem with all visualization, I say. All right. Like not just the tangible visualization, which is inherently 3D, but even the like purely graphical visualization is always bound. And so I don't know. I think that the way, so we haven't tackled that problem first of all, so I can only completely speculate on this, but I'd say that the approaches are probably to break down the problem into things that you can visualize, right? Between the combination of tangibles and the graphical displays that you have. So already, if you have many tangibles operating in 3D space in the physical world, plus you can start to overlay information on that, virtual information on top of that, or couple that with virtual information, whether it's shown on the wall or on the table or on other devices, or through augmented reality, then I think you can start to tackle those sorts of problems. But I think the way to start is to take something small, relatively, and then work ground up to start to kind of design a toolkit of approaches that can handle even more, even greater complexity. But I think that's a fabulous direction of work. Yes.
Any last questions? Okay, so if there's no more questions, let's thank our speaker.